Good morning, Nouri. Good morning, Dr. Nouri. All is good?
Yes, I will. Thanks. I will try to put the screen.
Yes.
I will not try to put.
Can you hear me, Nori? Hello?
Oh, yes. Hello, Bert. I am trying to understand how to put this virtual screen.
If you go to camera and right of the camera, you have something, you have an arrow up.
I am in...
No, in your, like on your screen, at the bottom line where you have the microphone, the camera, the number of participants, and so on. When you go to video and you have a little arrow upwards right next to the video.
Yes, in one part of selection of the screen, but
correct.
There I can't add another one.
No, selection of the camera, it should say, right?
Webcam.
Yeah, and in the second section of that list, you should have a longer list there, depending on how many cameras you have connected. It says blur my background, and underneath
virtual background and video.
Yes, and underneath choose virtual background. You have
in
something...
which one? In selection of the virtual, because in selection of the virtual
Yes, selection of, if you go to selection of the virtual, and then on the top right hand, you should have a plus sign like add picture or
general video, audio.
Let me just do that here on my screen. Yeah, it says virtual backgrounds, video filters, avatars, and then on the right-hand side, you have a plus, correct?
Plus, yes, plus.
Yeah, if you click on click on the plus, and then you have the choice of add image or add video.
Image,
and then
yes,
you find
I am opening that. I am opening that.
Okay.
Okay, so we will have to do a test with the interpreters. Yannick, Jimmy, can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Okay, can we perform a test? So
yeah, the first thing you need to do is to activate the interpretation.
Yes, so we added your emails as interpreters.
That's right. Yeah, so we're in the system, but now you need to activate it a second time. Yeah, exactly.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
So you see the globe. Yes, now you can see the interpretation.
Okay, great.
Fantastic.
Okay, so
but I managed.
So I will switch to French, Yannick, just to see if it's working while Dr. Nouri and Dr. Bert are discussing.
Sorry, I mean, I managed to add my virtual, the screen that you sent it, but then appears that my PC doesn't admit to put one, to add.
Yes, no worries, Dr. Nouri. We can see you very, very clearly and very well. And Yannick, I heard clearly and properly the French interpretation.
This is Jimmy, interpreter. Yes, I need to be assigned as well, please.
Okay, Jimmy.
So my name is Int Jimmy.
Okay. Okay, Jimmy, you are now assigned. True? Okay, Jimmy.
Channel.
Okay, Jimmy, can you confirm that you are well assigned? Yes, I can't hear you, Jimmy. Yes, Yannick, you can hear us? Okay, great. So welcome also for we now have around 34 attendees with us. So welcome everyone. We will start in 10 minutes from now. حط الفيديو. So, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for all our most esteemed participants. And thank you so much for joining us to this second webinar organized by G-Force on food fraud. I would like first to thank our partners, the International Union of Food Science and Technology, IUFAST, and the Arab section of AOAC International for their continuous support to G-Force in its efforts to disseminate knowledge related to food regulatory sciences worldwide. Our webinar will be held over 2 days, today and tomorrow, from 2 to 3:30 GMT plus 2, as for the following program. So allow me to share with you the poster of our program in order to introduce both days. Here, I would like also to thank our most esteemed speakers for their kind contribution to making this webinar happen and a reality. Thank you so much, our most esteemed speakers, for your presence today and for our speakers for tomorrow. Our program for today will consist of 3 sessions, covering an introduction to food fraud, delivered by G-Force's president, Professor Samuel Godefroy, followed by 2 presentations delivered by Dr. Bert Popping, who is the CEO of the strategic food consulting company Focus, regarding the challenges related to this very problematic issue in light of the deteriorating economic situation worldwide, and the last development in food fraud detection. For the second day, we will tackle regulatory and preventive aspects of food fraud. We will be joined by Dr. Eric Marin, who will be delivering a presentation on the EU Agri-Food Fraud Network, as well as by Dr. Karen Everstein to speak about how to conduct a hazard analysis for food fraud. Dear esteemed participant, please, questions will be answered during the Q&A session. So during this Q&A, if you're allowed to raise your hand in order to ask your questions, and you will be provided with the required permission to do so. Or you can type your questions in the Q&A box all over the presentations and the webinar. We will also provide a simultaneous interpretation to French for our French audience. So don't forget to click on the interpretation button and choose your preferred language. I would like also to start by thanking my co-host for today, Dr. Nuri Gras from Chile. Thank you, Dr. Nuri, for joining us and for co-hosting the session of today. Allow me to introduce our first presentation, which will be delivered by Professor Samuel Godefroy, who is a professor in food risk analysis and regulatory policies at Université Laval, and our president, the president of the Global Food Regulatory Science Society, G-Force. He will be stating the frame and the framework of our discussions during these 2 days on food fraud by introducing this problematic. So the floor is yours, Professor Samuel Godefroy.
Very thankful to the Global Food Regulatory Science Society for the invitation and for enabling me to give this introductory talk of this webinar devoted to food fraud. I would like to thank the organizers, including the Platform of Food Regulatory Science and Regulatory Excellence at Université Laval, as well as Arabe OAC and IOFOST for their kind invitation. So this talk is meant to position the two webinars planned by GForce on food fraud and give a general perspective, including on the regulatory management of food fraud after defining and offering some general representations of these incidents. Now, food fraud has been witnessed as much or as long as food has been produced and been used as an entity for commercial value. So essentially, for as long as humans have been trading food products, we have witnessed incidents of food fraud. And this slide offers a representation of the number of commodities that have suffered in the recent past, but even earlier, decades ago, from these phenomenon of food fraud. So olive oil, spices, wine production, juices, or even the sale of fish and fish products. Now, while we continue to discuss a harmonization of the definition of food fraud within the context of the Codex Alimentarius Commission, we have witnessed that a number of food regulatory jurisdictions have adopted a definition of food fraud. And while there are some differences, we see some commonalities in these definitions. First of all, food fraud is a deliberate act. So essentially, this is something that some producers who intend to do so deliberately do. It is not, for example, the result of environmental contamination or of something that is happening in an adventitious manner. Generally, the objective is economic gain, but mainly for illicit purposes. These incidents are not meant to be discovered, and that's why they're not supposed to produce public health impacts, because generally when that happens, the event is no longer hidden. And also we can witness situations of food fraud without alteration of the composition of the product. It may simply be related to a misrepresentation of the food product. Now, of course, a number of incidents that have happened in the recent past have put this phenomenon at the forefront of food-related challenges. Many of us remember the Melamine Incident because of the public health impact it resulted into. More than 300,000 illnesses and deaths amongst the most vulnerable subset of the populations witnessed in 2008. The 2013 Horsemeat Scandal and the widespread of this incident amongst over 28 European countries, showing that essentially a number of products which were supposed to contain beef were essentially sold containing another species of meat, and mainly horse meat, put also this at the forefront. And we've seen essentially during this incident a number of regulatory agencies, particularly in Europe and also in North America, consider this as an important issue and taking action to better prevent, manage these situations of food fraud. Now, when we look at the manifestations of food fraud incidents, it spans from the intentional misrepresentation, again, without altering the composition of the food. So essentially through mislabeling or misrepresentation, for example, presenting food from an origin that is different from where the food was sourced. For example, introducing different species of meat or different species of fish, but also altering the weight and the volume of a product. So essentially misrepresenting these values, trying, of course, to have more gain. Now, generally, these incidents do not result in a public health impact. When public health impacts may be foreseen is when we alter the composition of the food. And generally, this happens through a possible dilution of the product and then a substitution with the potential to mask that dilution. So, of course, when this alteration takes place with the addition of an ingredient that is harmless or that is of a food grade nature, then generally this does not result in the introduction of hazards. But when this alteration takes place with the introduction of a new hazard, we may witness public health impacts, which can be of an acute nature. So, for example, either there is an introduction of a high level of a product, like what happened with the Melamine incident, or the introduction of an ingredient that is likely to induce an acute reaction, like the introduction of a food allergen that is not foreseen. So, for example, the dilution of spices with peanut shells, and with the likelihood of the introduction of peanut with the shell as well. Now, there are situations where the public health impact may be considered as silent because the substance that was introduced as a result of this substitution, for example, the introduction of industrial dyes in order to mask the dilution of spices, this introduction may lead to a chronic risk simply because these substances, for example, may be carcinogenic, and at the level that they were introduced, they are not of a nature that would cause an acute risk. Now, when we try to position the way food fraud needs to be managed, considering the Codex mandate, which is essentially aiming to protect consumers' health, so essentially with the food safety objective, and with a second objective, ensuring fair practices in the food trade, primarily food fraud incidents are meant for the most part to alter the representation of the food, and they tend to cover the second mandate of Codex. But the minute the food fraud incident results in alteration of the composition of the food with the likelihood to introduce new health risks, then essentially these incidents cease to be hidden. And as a result, essentially we enter into the first mandate of Codex, and the management of food fraud will be part of the management of food safety. Now, when we look at the way regulators have attempted to manage this situation, we actually travel through time all the way to the 1750 BC, where we find the first texts that have attempted to introduce food laws, or at least measures that were meant to deter possibilities of frauding in food production. And in fact, the Hammurabi Code was found to be one of the first texts of law that aimed to punish situations of alteration, for example, of measures and weights related to food production. And the consequences essentially in those cases were very deterring, in the sense that those who were found to be convicted of these crimes would be punished, or would face a punishment by drowning, so essentially death by drowning. So you see that the consequences were not small in this regard. Now, when we move and fast track quickly to the current age, we find that a number of food laws find their inception in the management of food fraud. So essentially, before even we started regulating food safety, we look at the contemporary texts legislating or regulating food, we find that their essence is coming from the management of food fraud incidents, such as, for example, the management of adulteration of alcoholic beverages. And in fact, some of the texts that we have seen coming from the Middle Ages, so the Assize of Bread in the 13th century in England, regulated, for example, the price and the weight of bread with fines and prison sentences related to, frauding, so essentially incidents of fraud in this regard. And we looked also at similar situations where in France, there was the introduction of a wine standard, essentially qualifying the quality requirements of wine, which allowed essentially to define incidents or situations which contravened this standard. Now, moving forward to contemporary periods, 1860 with the Adulteration of Food and Drinks Act in the UK and in the British Empire, with the intent essentially to protect consumers from imported products, and mostly focusing to wholesaler. In 1872, we've seen the introduction of the Adulteration of Food and Drugs Act, with an authority given to regulators to take samples, and also with the attribution of responsibility to producers and wholesalers in the way these incidents are to be managed. The introduction of standards of identity was identified as a tool to help preserve the authenticity of food products and better protect consumers. And the 1890 amendment that was introduced in Canada permitted essentially government to create standards to define the characteristics of a food, and these standards became part of regulations. And in fact, the first Canadian standard was developed in this regard for tea. Unfortunately, this was not further generalized to other food products, simply because it was not afforded by regulators. Now, when we try to regulate these incidents of food fraud, we tend to focus on the potential impacts that happen as a result of these incidents. And these impacts can be, in fact, of a low-risk nature, where we see that mainly the main impact is an economic impact, meaning that the consumer is cheated and ends up paying more for a product that is of a lesser quality. But there are potentials for increased risk. And we see essentially that when these incidents are either repeated or they tend to be discovered with a potential health impact, we may see, of course, an increase of the impact moving to a potential loss of confidence of consumers and a loss of trust in the way foods are produced, all the way to significant health and safety impacts, essentially leading to public health issues, like essentially was the case with the Melamine incident. And of course, if we are to impose measures that are commensurate to the level of risk that is witnessed as a result of food fraud, we see that regulators have adopted also an incremental approach in the way these incidents are to be managed, moving from a reactive approach. Essentially, most of the food laws that we witness internationally would have provisions that are meant to protect consumers from misrepresentation. And these are meant primarily to, for example, prevent situations of misrepresentation, for example, of products of different origin, different species, different weights, different volumes, moving to a stronger set of penalties when the impacts are bigger, either as a result of repeat offenses or because these impacts may lead to public health repercussions. And in this regard, when these impacts tend to be higher, it is very important that the framework moves from a reactive approach to a preventive approach. Preventive approach meaning to the development of instruments that would allow to predict these situations, to identify indicators of their occurrence, and therefore to mandate requirements by producers to avoid these incidents from happening in the first place. So essentially through the introduction, for example, of vulnerability assessments and the identification of potential risks resulting from these incidents, with taking the appropriate measures from preventing their occurrence in the first place. Now, in general, the way food fraud would be or would need to be managed could be mirroring approaches that are adopted for food safety. So, of course, in prerequisite programs, looking at the way, for example, suppliers are identified and are managed, but also through the development of specifically targeted preventive approaches that are dedicated to the prevention of food fraud incidents. Of course, traceability would support a better reactivity when situations of food fraud are identified, and essentially there is a widespread of those. Having the appropriate traceability mechanisms would allow to limit and to mitigate those incidents. Now, of course, when we look at the current focus that is being applied by food producers and on the direction that is provided by food regulators, the focus is on preventive tools. And this is where a number of food safety and quality management systems, particularly those that are advocated by the third-party assurance programs, those proprietary food safety and quality schemes, such as the BRC, the IFS, the SQF, or those systems that are benchmarked against the Global Food Safety Initiative. These systems have developed a number of tools useful to assess vulnerability of the supply chain and to identify some early markers for the potential introduction of food fraud in the supply chain, and therefore the development of mitigation tools that would prevent these incidents from happening, or that would help, in fact, mitigate their impacts. Now, of course, another set of tools that would be extremely useful for those who are interested in managing food fraud, both from the regulatory standpoint as well as from the supply chain, is the availability of food analytical methods and the reliance on methods that can support to confirm authenticity of value-added products, or the determination of markers of fraud are essentially key elements in the arsenal to combat food fraud. And that's why AOAC International has devoted some efforts in the harmonization of non-targeted methods, as well as targeted methods that are known to identify some known markers of adulteration. Now, of course, in all this, we need a number of developments and progress. Mainly, there are some efforts that need to be devoted to better convergence of the methodologies and approaches that are used for vulnerability assessment. We have various tools and therefore various methods. A number of these approaches are not necessarily accessible, so they're not open access. A number of those also are not necessarily adaptable to small and medium enterprises. For laboratory methods, continued effort in standardization and harmonization of methods is needed. And of course, continued discussion amongst the regulatory community for better harmonization of the requirements to be imposed on food producers in order to prevent and mitigate food fraud are needed, particularly under the auspices of the Codex Alimentarius Commission. Now, the organizers of this webinar, or some of the organizers of this webinar, such as Université Laval's Food Risk Analysis and Regulatory Excellence Platform, the Institute of Nutrition and Functional Food, as well as a number of industry partners and AOAC International, attempted to contribute over the past period through the organization of a number of workshops under the name of Global Understanding of Food Fraud, attempted essentially to bring together a coalition of stakeholders fostering collaborative efforts and the creation of a global coalition of thought leaders in order to help manage food fraud. And amongst the areas of focus that were identified through these efforts, the need to continue to invest for collaborative leadership amongst food regulators and more convergence of guidance and requirements. The continued development of more applicable tools and guidance to industry in order to assess the vulnerability of the supply chains and take the appropriate actions when those vulnerabilities are identified, and also further investment in the development of analytical methods and their standardization. And this is where the leadership of AOAC International is required. At the regulatory level, continued effort and continued work under the CC-FIX and the Codex Alimentarius Commission will hopefully contribute to more convergence of guidance to industry and regulatory requirements in this area. Now, a number of tools will help facilitate that. Of course, the availability of intelligence gathering and early identification tools of these incidents, learning from these incidents, from food fraud incidents, once they are documented and once their levers are well understood. Further development and dissemination of vulnerability assessment and management tools. Again, I mentioned the analytical methods, but also efforts of risk communication and better education of consumers, ensuring again that consumers maintain their confidence in the food supply. This all requires collaborative approaches, gathering government organizations, regulators, industry, academic institutions, as well as consumer organizations. And a number of facets of these efforts will be further discussed during the course of this webinar and during the course of these couple of days organized by the Global Food Regulatory Science Society and its partners. Once again, I'm very thankful to the organizers of this event for including me to open up the discussions, and hopefully this helped position this issue and their challenges and will help further the debate with our upcoming speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Godefroy, for your kind presence with us today. Please allow me to remind all our esteemed participants that we have a simultaneous interpretation to French that you can access by clicking the interpretation button and choosing the appropriate language. And to answer a few of your questions, all the material or even all the webinar is actually recorded. It is broadcasted on our YouTube channel and it is broadcasted on our social media platform. So all the recording will be provided and will be kept over our YouTube channel, over our social media platforms that we kindly invite you to follow and to connect with us on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on our YouTube channel, and on Twitter. And of course, all the material will be also provided on our GForce website, gforce.org. One more thing, if you allow me, please, that all the questions will be dealt with during the Q&A session at the end of our today's webinar. And here, allow me to hand the floor to my colleague, Dr. Nouri, in order to introduce our next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amin. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone. Dr. Bert Popping is Managing Director of the Strategic Food Consulting Company, Focus. He previously worked as Chief Scientific Officer and Director Scientific Development and Regulatory Affairs for multinational contract laboratories. Dr. Popping has more than 20 years experience in the food industry and is author over 50 publications on topics of food safety, food authenticity, food analysis, validation, and regulatory assessments. Dr. Popping is member of the editorial board of Journal of AOAC, Food Additives and Contaminants, the Journal of Food Analytical Methods and Quality Assurance and Safety of Crops and Foods. He also is active member of numerous national and international organizations like SIM, ISO, BSI, and several German working groups. Dr. Popping today will present us two presentations. The first one entitled Times of Travel, Times of Fraud, and the second one entitled Heat Mix, the Food Authenticity Method Charts. Please, Dr. Popping, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nuri. I'm trying to share my screen number 2, and hopefully that should work. Can you see the screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, fantastic. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me for this presentation. Now I have 2 presentations, and I think the allocated time is something like an hour. I will try to cut that a little shorter so we have a little more time for question and answer. So now times of trouble, times of fraud is what I'm going to talk about. Many of you, all of you, I presume, remember this one, coronavirus, and then this one, that's the flag of the Ukraine. Let's take a step back and start with the corona crisis. I don't know what it looked like in the countries that you're in, but at least here in Central Europe, and I know also from the US, it was the same picture. People basically stockpiled paper, all sorts of paper, including toilet paper, basically the quantities they would normally use in 2 years. I don't know what people did with all the toilet paper, but there you go. So we found empty shelves. But more than that, it was not just the toilet paper that was stockpiled. It was also other foods, like durable foods, rice, pasta, canned tomatoes, and so on that was stockpiled. Basically, what happened was the demand outpaced the supply by far. So under normal circumstances, the shelves would have still been stocked, but now because consumers were basically panic buying, the shelves were empty because the food industry just simply didn't have the resources to cope with the additional demand that we saw. And also, of course, there were some sicknesses, some deaths, all basically impacting the supply chain. And what we saw as a consequence is that the prices and the demand were kind of basically prices were go up, demand was going up. So the typical scenario. And that is a scenario where very often food fraud happens. Now, the next slide is taken from the IFST online library. It's basically food fraud incidents, data comparison. And what you can see, the dark green is comparing the 2019, so more or less before Corona, with 1 year later, so basically when we have been in Corona. And what you can see, if you just look at the official sources here, you can see that there is already, based on Corona alone, and that was before the Ukraine invasion by Russia started, a significant increase in food fraud cases. So now we're having an even worse situation, because previously with Corona, well, we have some staff shortages and there were some disruption of the supply chain, but it was not really a shortage of materials that were produced. It was more a shortage of workers, disruption because the lorry drivers couldn't pass the borders and so on. So now we have a significantly more severe situation. And here you can see, we're just looking at what the Ukraine and Russia produce. And when we look at the sunflower seed, so basically the oil and the cake that is produced from them, Russia and Ukraine produce more than half of the global quantities. That means those two countries, if there is no production or no export, there will be a very severe shortage of sunflower oil and cake. And then it's also a major producer of wheat and barley. So that will also impact. on the disruption of supply chain, the shortages. So some countries have already positioned themselves to try and kind of alleviate some of the effects that we're seeing as a consequence of that. And the Canadian Agro-Food Policy Institute, they published a report, and this is taken from that report, where they look at the different commodities. And certainly Canada is one of the major producer of canola. So here they can basically help to limit the impact of the shortages of sunflower oil, because canola oil or rapeseed oil can kind of replace, in some cases, the sunflower oil. Now, when we're looking at the wheat, where Ukraine and Russia are major producer, you can see that Canada and US do play a major role, but it's still limited. The impact will still be fairly severe. And of course, that triggers the concerns, and quite rightly so, of food fraud. And the more so if you look at the food price index. So this is taken from FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and you can see this is the year. So from January to December, and here you can see the curve for 2019. You can see the curve for 2020, so it was a little down here in April, May, it went up in November, December, and in 2021, that is basically the time of the Corona crisis impacted. It went significantly up already. And now look what happened when the Ukraine war started here in 2022. Basically, the prices exploded. And that is particularly for vegetable oil, for example, the sunflower oil where Russia and Ukraine is a major producer, but also for cereals. So here you have a significantly heightened risk of food fraud, not only the impact of the Corona crisis, but now on top of that, the lack of resources, the lack of sunflower oil, and the lack of cereals. So now there are different types of food fraud that you can look at. There's gray market production, there's mislabeling, adulteration, and counterfeiting. Some of them you can detect analytically, others more difficult. So here, gray market production, it's very difficult to detect that analytically. You need to have traceability, and we're coming to the traceability aspect that Sami already mentioned a little later. And then you have mislabeling, of course, if you have the right tools and you can identify, for example, that a pine nut was replaced by a peanut, clearly you can identify mislabeling. Counterfeit, maybe the label is not the same as the original bottle, or maybe the content is not, and therefore you might also be able to analytically detect the fraud. But here, adulteration, that is certainly the one that can, in the vast majority of cases, be detected using analytical tools. And here we have different categories. We have dilution. So for example, if you place water in milk. Substitution, that was the example already provided, where the pine nuts, the expensive pine nuts, are replaced by cheap peanuts. The unimproved enhancement, Sami mentioned the azo dyes. So here, for example, for paprika, if you add azo dyes to make the paprika look more reddish, so it sells at a higher price, that would be an unimproved enhancement. Concealment is basically when you blend a high quality olive oil with cheap lampant oil. So there are different types, and all of them can be detected, and we're seeing how they can be detected later on. Now let's go back to the risks that we're facing with the current crisis. So I categorize that in two different groups. There are the direct risk, that is due to the agricultural production losses in the Ukraine, and due to the actual agricultural export bans from Russia. And then, of course, the indirect impacts, and that is due to the increasing cost of fuel and production, and they significantly went up, but also due to the increasing fertilizer prices. which we must not forget. So if you ask me what we might see, so we might see a lower quality wheat with added high protein flour, for example, coming from legumes. We might see a lower quality wheat that may have a significantly higher mycotoxin content. And if this is basically added or has added legumes, there might be undeclared allergens from the legumes. From the oils perspective, we will see presumably sunflower oils mixed with other low quality oils, or even the replacement oil. So in this case, it could be soybean oil, or it could be canola oil being adulterated itself, because there will be a shortage of those oils as a consequence of trying to replace the sunflower oil. So there might be contaminated oils. Now, let me take you back to 2007. I don't know who remembers those days when we also had a crisis. And let's just look. So you see two lines here at the beginning. The top line are the food prices, and the bottom line is the fertilizer prices. And very often they go hand in hand. And the fertilizer prices tend to be a good indicator a little earlier sometimes than the food prices that something is wrong in the market. So let's see how that develops. And you can see in 2008, those two curves peaked. And that was basically the time of the world food price crisis. And similar to the situation that we have now, we had as initial causes droughts in grain producing countries, a rise of oil prices, here it's the petrol prices, and a significant rise, and you can see that here, in the fertilizer prices. And in 2008, we actually saw food price riots in several countries. And on top of that, if that wasn't enough, we also had the melamine incident in infant formula. Now, melamine is a particular molecule that is very nitrogen rich, and sometimes it's added to increase the apparent protein content. So here it was used to increase the apparent protein content of milk, but it could equally be used if you use a certain quantification technique called Kjeldahl. It could equally be used for wheat, because now we have a shortage of wheat in the market. So that's something to watch out for. So history, unfortunately, repeats itself often enough for all the wrong reasons. So we might be in a situation where melamine becomes something to look out for again. So if we compare the 2007 and 2022 situation, you can see clearly the similarity: high fertilizer prices, grain shortages, high oil prices. Well, in 27, 28, we had the melamine incident and we had food riots. So I think right now we have a perfect recipe for disaster. So how can we mitigate that risk? And Sami already mentioned the vulnerability assessment, but there is another tool, that's testing. So one of the things that is basically paramount for any food manufacturer is to revisit their vulnerability assessment in light of the changing market situation and the price situation. And one of the tools that you can use, there are several around, is the United States Pharmacopoeia pre-screening tool. I'm recommending this tool above other tools because it's kind of a quick assessment. It gives you, in a couple of minutes, an answer how likely your predominantly used ingredients are at risk of food fraud. And we published that in the Journal of IFT. And you can find all these graphics in that publication. It's an open access publication. So it's a very straightforward process. So you start with basically looking at what are the most important ingredients to the company. You draw up a short list. Then you group the ingredients. So are there spices? Are there dairy ingredients? Are there oil? And then basically identify all those that do require a vulnerability assessment. And here we've given you some guided tables of what you need to be looking at. For example, if you have a raw material, let's say a peppercorn, and you're importing peppercorn, there is a slightly lower risk that the peppercorns are adulterated. They might have their essential oils extracted. So that's another form of food fraud, but there will not be other added ingredients, maybe papaya seed, but that would be easily detectable. Now, if you have ground ingredient, it's very easy to add other substances. So the risk as the ingredient is processed becomes significantly higher. So this is the basis of that vulnerability assessment. So here you go. And then basically at the end of the process, you identify and then take action, maybe an additional audit, maybe additional testing for those products. And our recommendation, or my recommendation here, is to revisit your vulnerability assessment in light of the changed market situation, use a pre-screening tool, and deep dive into the top risk ingredients identified by that tool. And then, Karen, I know she's online, will talk about and I do apologize, I call it still discerners, it's actually Food Chain ID now, the food fraud database, or another alternative is the DigiComply database from SGS. So those are very valuable tools to monitor upcoming changes in different countries, because both food fraud data, or both databases, basically give you an insight into what happened in other countries where you might be shipping your products from to your site. So you get basically advance notice. So those are very essential tools, and I do recommend having at least one of those tools on board when you do your risk, your vulnerability assessment. And when the situation changes, that means when you have a new supplier, when the prices change, it's always worth doing a revisit of your vulnerability assessment. And then, of course, you need to ask, what is the result of the review of your supply chain disruption event? So what food vulnerabilities have you updated? What has changed in your prior to the, what you had prior to the vulnerability assessment that you've done now? What are the changes? What are the countermeasures that you're implementing now? So all these questions need to be addressed. And then, of course, you have another point. When you have the incoming raw material potentially from a new supplier, how do you test for them? How do you select which of the batches might be adulterated? And this part is equally important for food inspectors from government as it is for quality control managers of food companies. So one of the options is, of course, random sampling. So let's say you get 100 bags and you pick 2 bags out of the 100. So you have a 1 in 50 chance to find a bag that is adulterated. That's not a very good ratio. And then you send it to the laboratory and it comes back negative, but you don't know if the other 98 batches, or bags rather, are adulterated. So do we have tools to prevent that? And similar, when you go as a food inspector to monitor a site, which of the tanks here would you sample from? Top, bottom, middle? Which of those canisters that you see here on the right-hand side of the picture would you sample from? This one, or maybe is it this one that has the adulterated product, or is it this one? So random sample is never a good approach. So this is where we need to look out for alternative tests that can be done on site, that gives you a very quick idea of which of the bags or which of the containers might be the one containing the adulterated product. So the problem with testing in the lab is that it takes time. It's still essential, it's still necessary, because you do simply not have the tools that a laboratory has, the high resolution mass spectrometry. You cannot have that on site. It's almost impossible for most food manufacturers, but there might be other tools. And what do these tools need to provide? They need to be usable on location. They need to be usable fast, so basically point and shoot devices, as we call them, with no or very little sample preparation. And they can be used ideally for raw material buyers or quality control managers, or if you work for the government, for food inspectors. Do we have those devices? Well, yes, we do. And what we have done is we put a special section section together. You have a QR code here, and it will appear on the next couple of slides. So if you want to get your smartphone out, it will take you to an article where at the bottom of the article, you find a link to all these papers, and they're again open access. So Carmen Diaz and myself, we have put this special section on portable devices together, and here are a couple of the highlights of those special sections. So here you have a handheld near-infrared device that, using point and shoot method, hold it against the fruit, and you can identify fairly rapidly if that fruit is fresh or not. Now, that may not constitute an adulteration, but the next one certainly does. So if you sell a farmed fish as wild, it attracts a higher price because wild fish sells higher. You have the same tool that you can use to identify if you have farmed fish or wild fish. Point and shoot device in a matter of seconds. Similarly, if you are in Europe, for example, you have imports of basmati that are exempt from levy, exempt from import tax, basically. And what you find more frequently in the past than now, because now there have been methods developed, is that the basmati rice that is exempt from the levy or has a lower levy is adulterated with non-basmati varieties. And here again, using NIR, point and shoot device, it allows you to differentiate at the point and shoot in a matter of seconds if you have a basmati or not. And similarly, we talked about the sunflower oil that is now in short supply. Here is an approach that was done as part of a European Commission project, and that is an olive oil multi-sensor. Basically, it works with 3 different sensors: barometric sensor, near-infrared, and visual light sensor, and it is able to determine if your olive oil is truly extra virgin, or if it has been blended with refined oils, with lampant oils, and so on. So we do have a number of tools at our hands. Of course, it's always a question of how well they are validated, but it's up to you, the inspectors and the quality control managers, to contribute to that and to take one of those sensors and help with the validation for your particular system. And it will allow you to not randomly select samples, but to basically go across 100 bags very quickly in a matter of seconds and identify if one of the spectra you're reading from the incoming raw materials is different from the others. And that's where you take a sample. That's what you send to the laboratory. So with that, I conclude my first presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions. So Nuri, now
Thank
I
you
don't
very
know
much.
if you want to take
yes,
question
we have
now,
one question. I don't know, I mean, the questions now, or we wait till the second presentation?
That was my question too.
Yes. If you allow, we will kindly wait for the end of our webinar, and then we can group all our questions. Okay, we are recording all the questions on the chat and in the Q&A box. So I would like to ask our participants to continue asking their questions over the Q&A chat box, and we will take the questions at the end. Thank you.
Okay, then I will continue with my second presentation. We're looking a little bit more at the methods that can be used for detection in the lab, but also portable. And actually, and that's the items I would like to emphasize as well, you can use that. You can do food fraud testing at home, and I'll show you how. So HitMix, food authenticity method chart. That is my personal method chart, of course. And I like to go with the saying, horses for courses. It's a famous British phrase, and it means the right tool for the right matrix or the right analyte. There's usually not just one tool. If you want to detect something, there are usually several tools. Some are more expensive, some are less expensive. Some require educated staff, some don't. I think it's always worth evaluating your option. What might be the right method for that? So I'll give you an example. We have the case of oregano and the adulteration of oregano with olive and sumac leaves. So now you could go for a PCR, that is a polymerase chain reaction, a DNA-based method. And you have to have the primer specific to the adulterant. So you have to have primers that are specific for olive, and you have to have primers that are specific for sumac leaves. If there is another adulterant, another leaf, another herb maybe in there that is adulterating the oregano, and you don't have the primers, you won't see that. So PCR is a good tool when you know what you're looking for. But if you don't know what you're looking for, you won't be able to find it. This is where next generation sequencing comes in. So here, any plant species, any animal species, bacteria, viruses, you get it all, except that it takes quite some time. It's quite expensive. And I think cost-benefit ratio, it's, unless you're really looking for something that is severe, it may not make much sense to use a whole genome sequencing on what you're looking for. Instead, what you could do, if you know that your adulterant is plant or animal based, you could use specific primers, that is some sort of like targeted next generation sequencing, where you identify any plant that is in there or any animal. So for example, cytochrome B or cytochrome oxidase, sorry, that was meant to be for meat species, but so here you could look at animal species, for example, where you use cytochrome B or cytochrome oxidase 1, and it's more expensive than the PCR, but it's less expensive than the NGS, and you get all the species. So you don't have to specifically know what you're looking for. You just have to know, am I looking for plant species or animal species? So for plant species, you could use MAT-K, for example. So you have targets for plants and for animals, and next generation sequencing can give you an idea of which are the adulterants that you have. And then, who would have thought of that? You might even go for a very cheap method. Because if you have a guy that, or a person that is experienced in microscopy, he may be able to identify under a microscope for very little money the leaves from olive and from sumac. So this is why I say look very closely at the different options that you have in terms of analytical tools before making the decision. So if you have unlimited resources, you may go for next generation sequencing. If you know what you're looking for, you may go for PCR. And if you say, well, you know, most of that we know is plant-based, so we're looking for microscopy, that might get you way cheaper. So now, and here comes the next one is the picture that was also kindly provided by Karen Everstein. This takes me to the non-targeted analysis, and explains a little bit why we need to have and need to look at non-targeted analysis. So this is, and so keep the date in mind, so that was a query from 2017. That was the USP Food Fraud Database, now Food Chain ID database. And when you look at the different adulterants, cow's milk, 128 adulterants. So how many methods do you need to run to identify all possible 128 adulterants? Cost-benefit analysis would say it doesn't make sense to use all methods. So you might as well use some alternatives, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Olive oil, 39 known adulterants, and the emphasis on known because obviously fraudsters, as Semi pointed out, don't want to be found out, so they may use something that we haven't discovered yet. So this is why the emphasis on known adulterant. Orange juice, 38, 58 on chili powder, and 34 for beef. So we have methods for basically different types of adulteration, and For example, addition of cheap extenders, we can UV visualize, fluorescent, infrared, mislabeling, stable isotope ratio analysis, trace elements, animal and plant species, as I alluded to earlier, PCR or next generation sequencing, admixtures, mass spectrometry or gas chromatography. So we have the tools, but when you look at all the possible adulterants, it's kind of difficult to test for all of them. So either you have to focus or you use the different types of methods. But let's look at the selected, frequently adulterated commodities. Let's start with milk. What do we see in milk? So common adulterants of milk are water, starch, vegetable fats, formaldehyde, the melamine that we've heard about, nitrogen-containing compounds, urea, melamine. And if you buy sheep or goat milk, you may have an adulteration by the cheaper bovine milk. What do we have in our toolbox to detect that? So addition of water, cryoscopy, addition of starch, iodine, vegetable fats, fatty acid profile analysis, formaldehyde, liquid chromatography, nitrogen-containing compounds, urea, melamine, we can use LC-MS, addition of bovine milk, we can use PCR, and there are several other adulterants that we can detect using Fourier transformation, infrared or mid-infrared screening. Now for rice, I already mentioned the non-basmati and basmati rice. We have sometimes colorants that are used for fake black rice or paraffins for translucency. So for the basmati, non-basmati, you can use PCR or next generation sequencing. And as I pointed out, also NIR. For colorants, you can use LC-MS, and for paraffins, you can use HPLC. For the herbs and spices, azo dyes, fillers, sand, dirt or clay, bran, safflower, especially for saffron. So here, again, same toolbox, liquid chromatography coupled to mass spectrometry. For the filler, dirt and clay, we can use simple microscopy or even sieving. For saffron adulteration, for safflower adulteration in saffron, we can use PCR and microscopy. But let's do a quick detour. And I mentioned earlier that you are actually able to do food fraud detection at home in your kitchen. This is something that I thought was worthwhile showing. When you read DART, what are you thinking about? Well, being a scientist, the first thing that came to mind when I saw the word was direct analysis in real time, which is a mass spectrometry kind of test that uses ambient, where you can shoot basically material into the mass spec and then it's being analyzed. Now, the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India actually has termed DART detect adulteration with rapid tests. So it means something completely different. And it's meant for consumers. It's meant to be done at home with the tools that you do have usually in your kitchen. And that I find very interesting, because that is something that's an approach that should be promoted, I feel, and should be propagated through different countries, because it's so simple, because they use things that everybody has in the kitchen, or most people do anyway. And they cover quite a range. So they cover milk and milk products, oils and fats, sugars, food grains, spices, and other materials. So let's just say you have black pepper adulterated with papaya seeds. If you put it in water, you can see that the black pepper sinks to the ground. The papaya seeds, because they're much, much lighter, they float in the water. So it's a very simple detection, just using a glass of water. Similarly, when you have colorants like azo dyes in spices, what you can do is basically you put the spices on top, carefully though, the spices on top of the water layer. And if there is color, you will see those clouds from the artificial color. If you have the spices that have not been adulterated, you won't see those colors basically forming clouds in the glass. Similarly, grass seed colored with charcoal in cumin seeds. And here, a very common one, dilution of milk with water. And this is what pure milk looks like. And if you have it adulterated or diluted rather with water, it looks very different. Again, you could do that at home. And unfortunately, especially in India, you find, not just India, but also other countries, you find that to kind of preserve milk, they put detergent in it, which is adverse to health. So it's not very good to have detergent in your milk. And again, it's similar. You just add water to it, and it will show different if you have adulterated milk. So this is the unadulterated milk, and this is what the adulterated milk look like when you have added water and the milk contains detergent. So a very simple test that everybody can do at home. So I thought it was a fantastic idea of the FSSAI to put such a booklet out and provide their citizen with tools that allows them at home to detect food fraud. Now we're coming to one of my favorite topics, it's honey. And honey has a very interesting history, because when you look at the sequence of events, especially the sequence of adulterations and the types of adulteration that you see there is an evolution, and the fraudsters tend to stay one step ahead of the game. So let's take a step back into the past and look what happened. And Sami mentioned AOAC, and one of the first AOAC approved method for honey was the delta 13 carbon element analyzer isotope ratio mass spectrometry for the identification of C4 sugars. So basically, honey was adulterated or stretched with corn sugar or sugarcane sugar. So those are C4 sugars. So then there was this method, delta 13 method. So now the adulteration with corn sugar could be detected. Voila, the fraudsters came up, adulterating the honey no longer with C4 sugars, but with C3 sugars, so for example, from wheat or rice starch. So then the scientists developed a method to not only detect the C4 sugars, but also the C3 sugars. Then all of a sudden, when the C3 and the C4 sugars could be detected, the fraudsters came up with purified or refined syrups that were not detectable with that method. So then the scientists developed specific enzymatic marker tests to uncover that. And then you had the introduction of additional specific markers for rice sugar and color. And then there was an NMR profiling. So now we have an additional adulterant, that's specifically mannose and psychose, in highly refined syrups. And we have tailored syrups. And if you go to some of the platforms, the online trading platforms, the likes of Alibaba, you find that people sell sugar syrups, and they even give you the types of tests they will pass. So for example, you find a product, this syrup will pass the delta C13 test or the NMR test. And so you know it's already, basically you can buy something regularly online in an online trading shop to adulterate the honey in large quantities. So I think it's basically a cat and mouse system here, where you always try to stay ahead of the games, but the fraudsters are the ones that tend to invent new methods and tend to invent something that we haven't been testing for. And this is why we need non-targeted methods. And here I'm showing you the slide from 2017, again, that you saw before, that was kindly provided by Karen. And now this is the updated slide from 2020 from Food Chain ID. And when you go back just one more time, you can see milk here has 128 known adulterants. And now, a couple of years later, we know of 163. So there are probably many, many more out there that we haven't discovered. So this is where the non-targeted analysis comes in. And what does it do different? The targeted analysis looks for the compounds you know of, so urea, melamine, azodize, and so on. But if the fraudsters come up with a new trick, with a new adulterant that you haven't been looking for, you're unlikely to find it. So this is where the profile screening comes in. And this is called non-targeted analysis, because what you're looking for here is not an individual adulterant. What you're looking for is the overall profile of a commodity, so say honey. And if there is a significant change against a reference profile. So for this, you need reference material. So let's say you're having Manuka honey from Australia, New Zealand, then you would need a reference database with Manuka honey, and that needs to encompass different years, different seasons, when the honey, when the bees produce the honey, from different beehives, of course. So you need to have that reference database. Then you need to have a system that calculates the overall profile, and there will be an upper and a lower limit, as you can see here. And if your sample falls within that limit, that's the solid blue line, it's less likely to be adulterated. But if it's outside, there is a good chance, like here, that peak that you see, there's a good chance that there's something in there that does not match the normal Manuka honey. Of course, you always have the chance that that might be a seasonal variability, but if it is, you add that to the profile, adjust the profile accordingly, and next time it will stay in. But if it's really an adulterant, you have discovered a new adulterant. And this is why there is a need for non-targeted analysis, because there's no other method available right now that allows you to take across the board changes to a product. And AOAC has actually formed a food fraud task force. And we have three, one for targeted testing, one for DNA, and I'm just mentioning the non-targeted testing that is led by John Spilker. And basically the concept here was to create a standardized fingerprint for an ingredient, to compare the new lots to the of ingredient to the fingerprint. So that's the profile that I explained to you. And then you have a chemometric examination to reveal if the differences are outside of the normal variability. So if we just go back, so the light blue area here is your normal variability. Oops, sorry. And if something is outside, then you would start investigating if that is food fraud. So for that, we have, for example, a baseline for honey. There is an SMPR, standard method performance requirements for honey, for non-targeted method. And here we define the specific parameters and also the number of samples to be tested to develop a non-targeted method for honey. And this brings me full circle, because here we're moving again to the portable devices, which most of them, if not all, are non-targeted. NIR in this case is a non-targeted method. And the multi-sensor from for detection of adulteration of extra virgin olive oil is also non-targeted. So again, here we need reference sets of data, but it will allow us to discover adulterants that we may not know are present. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention and hand back to Nur.
Dr. Amin, we have many questions.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, I will start. We have questions in
Yes.
the questions and answers, and also a few in the chat. The first question, Dr. Popping, is, in the case of oil, which compounds could be added, and what about the health risk for the consumers?
Those of you who have lived in Spain in the 1980s will recall the toxic oil syndrome. So there it was a adulteration. It was basically a door-to-door business. People went around, sold to the housewives very cheap canola oil. The canola oil was contaminated, causing the deaths of numerous Spanish people. And here we have a health impact. Normally, that is not the case because obviously the fraudsters do not wish to be uncovered. So what you often see is that, for example, extra virgin olive oil, if I was a fraudster, what I would use is refined oil. And then you add a little bit of copper chlorophyll to make it look green again. You know, refined oil looks yellowish, and of course it dilutes the intense green color that you find with extra virgin olive oil. But if you add a little bit of copper chlorophyll, which is fairly inexpensive, you get the green color nicely back. And until you're, unless you're a connoisseur or a gourmet, you may not be able to detect it even organoleptically. So what I would do if I was going as a fraudster. There are other ways you can use. There could be lampant oils that are not fit for human consumption, and we've seen that recently in the European Union, where they had incidents of lampant oil adulteration. So there are numerous ways of adulterating oils, but it's typically a cheaper oil, a refined oil, and that potentially added chemicals to make it look greener again.
Thank you. Another question. The most important herbs risk assessment that world needs to study.
Sorry, repeat for me, please. I didn't hear that one.
The most important herbs risk assessment that the world need to study.
Is that a question or a statement? I think
no, it's like a question. Which are the most important herbs risk assessment that the world need to study?
Well, I think we still have a couple of health risks that are at least equally important to health risks resulting from food fraud. When you think of pathogens, they kill many more people right now than food fraud does. So pathogens would still be my number one. But at the same time, if you look at health risks from food fraud, now we are in a situation where it's basically the perfect mix for a disaster for having an increased food fraud occurrence. And we saw that already based on the UK study after Corona, when only, and this is inverted commas, only the supply chains were a little disrupted. Now, with real shortages of supply, meaning sunflower oil, meaning wheat, we are much more likely at risk. So, and here you can imagine that not all the fraudsters are knowledgeable of what might have adverse health effects. So this is why it's very difficult to say we need to look closer at food fraud than pathogens, for example. I think that would be the wrong statement. At the same time, I think now we have definitely a heightened risk, and that will also increase the risk of food fraud with an adverse health effect.
Thank you. The next question. In the case of wheat or other grain, what could be an addition in the adulteration? Well,
if, for example, you wanted to increase the apparent protein content, you use nitrogen-rich compounds. So that could be urea, that could be melamine. So clearly, those have adverse health effects. Now, there could be other types of increasing the protein, or other ways of increasing the protein content. And that could be, for example, stretching the wheat with cheaper legume protein extract. So that could be an alternative. But then, of course, when you have legumes from peas, several people are allergic to peas, and if declared only wheat, people might eat it, and people with a pea allergy may then have a severe reaction to that. And we're already seeing that with a currently shifting trend towards vegan food, where it's more lentils, pulses, where you have potentially a much higher prevalence of certain related allergies to pulses, to lentils. So here we need to have an eye on those commodities that might be used and trigger allergic, so health effect, trigger allergic reaction.
Thank you. The next question, and they are arriving many other questions.
I can see.
You are in the examination. Is there any analytical methods to find the adulteration of reused oil by filtration or repackaging?
Reused oil could be like reused oil after frying, reused oil after. So I think we need a little bit of specification here to answer the question. I would say that if you have heated the oil, you will find traces depending on if it's if it contains unsaturated fatty acid or not, because you will find some degrees of oxidation after the heating process. So you might be able to detect it, but it's not something. It depends on what type of oil you're dealing with.
Thank you. Now arrives another one in the chat. As mentioned in your presentation, there a current need to check wheat. If so, can we fingerprint pure wheat with adulterated one by NIR?
Well, you would have to look at not just one wheat variety, but the ones that are commonly traded globally. So I think you would need to establish a reference database of the different wheats. So let's say your only source of income or of incoming wheat is from, say, Canada. Then all you have to do is kind of look at the wheat varieties that are coming in from Canada, create a reference database with those ones, and then you can very easily check if something is in that wheat, in a sample that you're getting using NIR. So yes, that's possible. But if you're sourcing your wheat from all over the place, your database needs to be a little larger. Still, having said that, I think we need to start somewhere. So it's still a useful exercise.
Another one, are regulators using the latest detection methods when they check foods? If not, doesn't that mean that fraudulent foods can be marketed?
That's a very good question. I like that. I have to change hats here because I also serve on some of the government working groups for method. So in defense of my friends and colleagues from the regulatory bodies, I have to say that if you want to take a fraudster to court, and we have done that in the past as on behalf of the government, you need to have a method that is watertight, that is 100% validated. So that means for enforcement, you need to have a confirmatory method. That is not a method that you would normally have in a portable device. The portable devices that I was referring to is really just to see which of the samples are what we call abnormal, that have an abnormal spectrum. The next step then would be to send that sample to a laboratory, and that could be a government laboratory, to test for the sample using validated and ideally standardized methods, so ISO, CEN, other standard, AFNOR standards, for example, method. So that would be the normal way. But what we're lacking right now is really the fact that the inspectors that are going out often are not using even the screening tools because we don't have a basis for that. European Commission is also, and Eric can correct me tomorrow when it's his turn to speak, is not rapid to kind of validate some of those portable devices that could have been used. Having said that, there is a big program, and that also goes back to what Semi said earlier about the traceability and the important traceability as part of your vulnerability mitigation measures. The European Commission has implemented a several €100 million worth program that basically increases traceability and detection of adulteration. So here in the outcome of that, some of the projects that have been funded, and we are fortunate to be in one of them, they will develop AI, so artificial intelligence-based traceability system, but they will also develop and validate analytical tools for the detection of adulterants on site. So for example, for quality control manager and inspectors.
Yes, now we have 3 questions related to honey. And as you like honey, I will read the 3 questions at the same together in order that you make the answer because they are related. Yes, one said, in the present scenario of honey adulteration, is LC, a high resolution mass spectrometer technique, is advisable in comparison to NMR? And then the other question said, is there any easy method other than IRMS and NMR to check honey adulteration? And then the next question also related is how to tell the difference between natural honey and sugar-fed bee honey?
Let's start with the last question. So
Yes.
The difference between natural honey and sugar-fed bee honey. Mind you that beekeepers in the cold season are permitted to feed the bees with sugar. That is legitimate. But if the honey has been adulterated with sugar, either C3 or C4, or if the bees have been fed the sugar, you can tell the difference, because if you're not only looking at the stable isotope ratio analysis of the sugars, but also the proteins that are basically in the honey from the bees, if that ratio is abnormal, then the honey has been stretched. If the ratio is on par, so the protein isotope ratio and the honey isotope ratio, then there is unlikely an adulteration. Now, the second question, is there an easy method other than RMS? Well, if it's a floral honey, I mentioned when we talked about the oregano adulteration with olive leaves, microscopy as a method. Now, I personally know somebody who's able to tell, for example, floral honey apart, and it takes a little bit of training. It does require to identify the different types of pollen. And here you can, for floral honey, easily distinguish. So I've seen pictures, for example, where in supposedly Central European honey, you had eucalyptus pollen. Now, if you live in Central Europe, you know that we just simply do not have eucalyptus here. So how does eucalyptus come into the honey? And that was identified using microscopy. So basically, that was actually Indian honey that was labeled as European honey. So here, very clear adulteration using a simple technology like microscopy.
Thank you. There are so many interesting questions. I am choosing some of them. Somebody that writes one question in French, but I will read it in English. The rapid methods to detect fraud can be methods to use during official controls?
During official controls, yes, but you still need a confirmatory method. The rapid methods can be used as a tool to select the samples. So what I tried to explain previously was that if you randomly sample, your chance of finding the adulterated bag in 1 of 100 bags is very slim. But if you use tools like NIR, it takes you only a couple of seconds to basically scan each of the 100 bags. So in let's say 10 minutes, you have scanned that 100 bags, and you know the one bag where the profile is abnormal. This is the bag that you take the sample from, and then you send it to the official control laboratories for confirmatory testing using a standardized and validated method. And this is then the method that you will go to court with.
A very interesting question here. They said very briefly, what could be the role of predictive food microbiology to prevent food fraud?
Predictive food microbiology to prevent food fraud? It's one of the few questions where I have to say I need to pass. I do not know.
Thank you. Another question. I know that they add some chemical like soda to decrease free fatty acid. How we can test that?
Well, you can use like for example, LC-MS-MS. You can use you can determine the quantity of sodium in the composition. So there are different methods. Specifically, I would need to check if there is a specific method for soda, but I'm sure there is one.
Yes. Another question, or is detection of food fraud is a strict mandatory requirement for food manufacturing companies? What is your opinion on related to that?
Well, under European law, we have a regulation that requires food manufacturers to not place products on the market that misguide the consumer. So as part of their responsibility, I would consider it a requirement, but also, and Sami mentioned the different standards that are under the Global Food Safety Initiative. So he mentioned the IFS, the FSSC 22000, the BRC GS standard, for example, and all of these manufacturing standards, they have specific requirements for vulnerability assessment. So right now we're seeing more requirements in the private law than we do see in the public law.
Thank you. Another interesting question is, would you say that organic foods are more safe to food fraud?
Well, it depends where the organic food comes from. The traceability is a key aspect here. Food fraud, usually the more complex the food supply chain is, the higher the risk of food fraud. And that applies no matter if you have an organic produce or if you have a conventional produce. So if you have a long supply chain, you can also have organic produce being adulterated. But even in regions with fairly short supply chains, we see adulteration of, or basically mislabeling. It is more a case. It's a mislabeling of conventional food as organic food. And that was part, I believe it was one of the OPSON operations, so the police operation that we have here in Europe and globally to identify and basically indict people that have committed food fraud. And we have seen a tremendous increase in the volume of organic produce coming, especially from the agricultural nations in Europe, and more so than can potentially be produced. So some of the products that were even certified to be organic have been tested and shown to be not organic. So that's always a good reason to have a certain degree of suspicion and not just trust everything blindly.
And now we have a very challenging question.
Okay,
they
here
said,
we go.
Consumers often wonder how they can protect themselves against these frauds. What are the easiest ways to do that?
Okay, here comes my favorite story. I always say if something is too good to be true, it's very likely not true. So what we had here in Germany a number of years back, the doner kebab, so that is meat on a skewer that you cut off, put in a bread roll with some lettuce, and so the prices dropped from somewhere around €3 to 99 cents. Now, how do you produce a doner with meat? For 99 cents, you have to pay the electricity, you have to pay the shop space that you're renting, you have to make a living. So it's not really possible. And even the authorities realized that for 99 cents, you cannot produce a doner with meat. So they started investigating, and what they found out was that, yes, what you had in your doner was of animal origin, but you normally find that type of material in pet food and dog food. So in order to make the 99 cents, you had basically some animal products in the doner that were not categorized as meat. So here, again, the simple answer is if something is too good to be true, so too cheap. So here we had the doner prices basically dropping by 60%. And there's an imbalance between the cost and the profit ratio. So this is a good indicator that something is wrong. And again, other than that, what you can always do is there is a big handbook that I showed you some examples of from the FSSAI that you can do in your kitchen. You know, we call that the armchair scientist. So every consumer can do that. If you buy peppercorns and they float, you probably have papaya seeds. So there are different tricks in that book of how to detect and uncover fraud. So this is the usual recommendation that I make to protect consumers from how consumers can protect themselves from food fraud.
I mean, I will make the last questions because we are 10 minutes late already, and there are many others, not many, but I think that most of the questions has been answered. Most of the questions has been answered. But we have a question from West Africa that said honey fraud is difficult due to their diversity. Is there any advice from the expert on how to build model for detecting honey fraud in West Africa?
It would depend on what type of fraud it is. If it's a floral honey that is adulterated with other floral honeys, it's usually easier. It's a question of training a person to recognize the different shapes of the pollen under the microscope. If it's an adulteration with syrups, you can use NMR databases, you can use high-resolution mass spectrometry devices that would give you the answers to that. Most of the types of adulterations in honey, you have already methods for, and you don't necessarily need to build the databases. The databases are already there. You buy that as part of the instrument package that you acquire. So there are methods around, and they are very well known. They've been standardized, have been validated. So there are tools available to do that, but it's a question of, you know, what is your budget for such instruments, because they don't usually come cheap. So do you have a higher budget? Can you afford a high resolution mass spectrometry or IRMS, for example? Can you afford an LC-MS? Can you afford a microscope? So it really depends on bringing your budget in line with the methodologies that you have available to uncover the fraud.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bert Popping. And I mean, I think that there are other questions that are, and also suggestions about to make a more workshop with more practical things, but maybe practicals are not so easy, but maybe more case studies, I think so. And then maybe we can continue another opportunity, because in Chile we have the experience with Dr. Popping that we have made more case studies, more training, and most of the answers, most of the questions that are there has been answered during more case studies.
Indeed.
Thank you very much, Bert.
Thank you.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Dr. Nouri. Thank you, Dr. Bert. At the end, I would like to thank all our audience today, all the participants from all over the world. In fact, during our webinar, we reached 160 participants at the same time attending our webinar. Thank you so much. I would like also to thank our interpreters who helped us all along these 1 hour and 44 or 45 minutes to interpret from English to French. Thank you so much. And at the end, please don't forget to join us also tomorrow for the second day of our webinar. We will try to complete the picture, complete the idea. So we'll have two very interesting presentations, one delivered by Dr. Eric Marin and one delivered by Dr. Karen Everstein, about preventive and regulatory aspects related to food fraud. So thank you so much. And as Dr. Nouri also said, we will take all the remaining questions also. We noted them, we will send them to our speakers in order to reach out to you in order to answer few or all of them. And thank you always for suggesting to us what might be interesting for you as our next webinar, perhaps new topics, or as well to go more into details with the topics we are already discussing during our series of webinars. Thank you so much for everyone, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye-bye.